This demonstration is to show you French seams. So French seams are a little bit different than traditional construction or putting something together in the way that many people know and understand. In French seaming, we are sewing everything twice, and our seam allowance is going to encase itself. So this is a self-finishing seam. There's no serging required. Often as we're constructing, putting things together, we're serging our raw edges first and then putting our pieces together so that there's no fraying or falling apart. But a French seam takes care of itself, so that can be really beneficial. So there'll be no raw edges showing once I'm finished with it. French seaming is also fantastic for sheer fabrics. In the case of sheer and very thin, lightweight fabrics, you can see through those fabrics. They're translucent. And so we often don't want to see a big, wide seam allowance. We don't want to see a serged edge through that. And so we are trying to keep our seams as neat and small as possible so that we are not distracted by looking at those seams. And we'll give you a cleaner finish. So definitely French seam things that are sheer. So for these purposes, I'm just using a plain quilting cotton. I chose it because it has a very distinctive right and wrong side to the fabric. So you can see the print versus the wrong side here. And that's really important when you're doing French seams, is understanding your right from your wrong side so that you flip it in the correct direction. Obviously with a sheer fabric like a chiffon or an organza, there often isn't a right or wrong side, and so keeping track of those pieces is also important. Okay, so with a French seam, I'm going to begin by matching up the seam I want to sew. But the strange thing about it is that I am going to place it wrong side to wrong side. So my fashion side is out, and that is kind of against the rules. We are used to sewing things together wrong to wrong and then flipping them, and the seam allowance will end up on the inside of the garment. This is not the case in the first step of the French seam. We have to sew it backwards, and then we will sew it together a second time that will turn it the correct direction. So do keep that in mind, that step one is placing it together wrong to wrong. As we start to pin together our seam, we also want to think about what our seam allowance is. So we will be sewing twice. We'll be sewing, flipping, and then sewing again. And because we do that, we have to divide our seam allowance given. So if my seam allowance is a 1/2 inch and I'm sewing twice, I will divide that in half, meaning I will sew once at 1/4 inch and then a second time at 1/4 inch in order to come to my 1/2 inch seam allowance total. If I were sewing a commercial pattern piece and I have 5/8 seam allowance, then I would want to divide 5/8. 5/8 doesn't divide very cleanly because it's an odd number. So you'd have to divide your seam allowance into 3/8 and 2/8. So 3/8 inch and then 1/4 inch. And as long as you are conscious of that and doing that consistently, then you will end up with your eventual 5/8 seam allowance encased in a French seam. Okay, so I'm ready to sew for the first time. I'm going to turn on my sewing machine. I've got it pinned wrong side to wrong side with the pretty side facing me. And I'm going to line up with the 1/4 inch line, which also corresponds with the edge of my presser foot. I will backstitch for a couple of stitches, again, not excessively, and then I'm able to stitch forward. And I will just maintain my 1/4 inch seam allowance by watching the edge of the presser foot and the edge of my fabric there. And I will stitch all the way to the edge and then backstitch. All right, so step one is done, but the seam is not done by any means. I can go back and clip my threads, make sure those are nice and neat. And now I need to iron my seam. I'm making sure that my iron is on the correct setting. All right, so traditionally when we would iron open a seam, we would open these seam allowances and put the iron right down the center and press those flat. But in the case of the French seam, it's not that wise to do that. First of all, that's a very small seam allowance to get in the middle of and iron that open. But also with the French seam, we will be trimming our seam allowance. So we do want to be careful with that and make sure that we are trimming appropriately. So I will get out my trusty pressing ham here and pull back just a little bit so you can see that. All right, now I'm going to use my iron to push my seam allowances to the same side. And the way I'm going to do that is by using my opposite hand to tug slightly on the fabric to give it a little bit of tension and then push those seam allowances over. This will help open my seam while still letting the seam allowance move to one side. And turn if you need to. If you're on an ironing table, it's probably a lot easier than what I'm doing right now. Then flip to this side where you can see the seam. Make sure it's still flat and smooth and open. Go back over it once more. Make sure that you haven't accidentally folded your fabric in there as you've been pressing. There we go. Okay, now we're ready for step two. And step two is to turn these together and sew again. But before I can do that, I have a very, very important step that you can't forget. So I've got to reduce my seam allowance here because in step two, I'm going to flip it right side to right side and I'm going to sew again and basically make a tube out of my seam allowance. But if I keep all of the seam allowance I have here, the chances of a little bit of the raw and fuzzy edge coming out of that seam is very great. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that seam allowance down. Trim both together, and that's kind of why we push them together. I'm going to trim them in half, so about 1/8 of an inch. Do be careful that you're not actually cutting into the seam itself. That would be unfortunate. Okay, so I've trimmed excess away. Like that. And I'm able to flip this over knowing that when I sew for the second time at 1/4 of an inch, I won't accidentally catch any of that seam allowance there. And it's often helpful once you're ready to flip it right side to right side and sew again to go back and actually iron the seam right on the edge. If you get it to lay down for you, then it will stay put better as you sew. Sometimes when we are working with sheer fabrics and they're much wigglier and don't like to press flat for us, I use a little bit of spray starch so that I get a little bit more stability in the French seam as I'm trying to press and sew it. It's kind of a lifesaver, so that's a good thing to keep in mind. You can see that I pressed my seam right on the edge there. I can add a few pins, and now I'm ready to go ahead and sew it for the second time to finish it up. All right, machine on once again. Going to line up the edge of my fabric, the seam that already is there, with the edge of my presser foot. Okay. There'll be one last time with my pressing ham and my iron to get everything to lay how I want it, but I'm almost there. Clipping my threads. And now you can see that I have a fully encased seam allowance. The first seam I sewed is right there on the edge. This is the second seam I sewed. So now my seam allowance is in this neat little tube. The front of my garment will look the same as if I had sewn a traditional seam, but secretly I've encased all that beautiful seam allowance on the back. It's really satisfying once it's done. Last step is to push that seam allowance again to one side with your iron. So just like I did the first time, I'm going to tug a little bit with my opposite hand to be able to control that seam and make sure it's nice and smooth and open. Turn it to the front side. And again, make sure it's nice and smooth there. And then the French seam is complete.